Hi everyone. I was trying to convince Mario and Dora to just get started since this is the final event of the fall season at the Townsend Center. But Mario wants me to say something to you, so I'll say happy holidays and I hand the mic over to Dora and Mario. We really look forward to your conversation.
Thank you.
So thanks.
Hey, all right. So thanks to everyone for being here, and thanks to Mario for this beautiful book. I'm really delighted to be in conversation with you about it. It's so wide-ranging and capacious and exciting. So hope we'll get into the many threads that you braid together in this book. And I thought I would just start by kind of describing what I think you're doing and then ask you to say more about what that is and to correct me. But I really see your book as in some ways a meditation on the utopian possibilities of itness. I think this is actually a phrase that you use. And as you write, and I'm quoting you here, the counterintuitive possibility that human self-determination and ongoing negotiation between identification and disidentification could entail calling oneself or acting as an it rather than as a he or she or they, even they. And so you focus on a group of Roman comedies that are named after objects and many other artworks besides. I mean, I think I've said to you in conversation and I'll say publicly, you're just one of the best read and most widely read people I know. It's just like incredible, the sort of range of your erudition. But you find in this group of Roman comedies that are named after objects, all sorts of ways in which people become objects, become too attached to objects, sort of think and perceive like objects in all kinds of funny ways. And these works become models for non-normative sociality and relationality. And this allows you to rethink the usual hierarchy and the relation between subject and object, that perennial problem. So, you ask what inter-objectivity rather than intersubjectivity can offer as a way of thinking about relationality and social connection, or as a relational counter-imaginary. So, of course, we usually think of objectivity or becoming objectification is bad, right? Subjectivity is the term that's valorized, but as you note, there's an extensive debate on and critique of the subject, most centrally for you in Black critical theory. You also invoke the Adornian principle that, I quote you, quoting Adorno, that subject is also object. It merely forgets as it becomes autonomous form how and by what it itself is constituted. So, this leads you to this idea of interobjectivity, which you also invoke as an alternative to non-normative cognitive modes that neurodivergence or neuroqueerness, as you also term it, can show us. So I'm wondering if you can say a little more about interobjectivity and how you're bringing together this array of theoretical discourses that you draw on. So, Black critical theory, especially Lacanian in its dialogue with Lacanian psychoanalysis, Adorno, obviously also object-oriented, ontology, disability studies, and many others besides, but those are some of the central terms. So, what are you getting from these?
Yeah, so thank you so much for your wonderful words, and thank you for doing this with me. It's very kind and very generous of you to do it during a busy semester. And many thanks to the Townsend Center, to Rebecca and Stephen for giving me once again the opportunity to talk about my work. So I would say that this book is really part of my general interest in trying to see how ancient texts, and in particular the kind of close reading of ancient texts that I'm invested in, can contribute to broad questions in critical theory. And in this case, the question is, can plays that have an object in the title help us understand how we should or we can conceptualize the relation between subject and object? And as you anticipated, I mean, the conclusion is that I do see Roman comedies and comedies in general unruly play with personification, objectification, literalization, as encapsulating fantasies of objecthood and expressions of a flat ontology that are associated with what is called non-neurotypical cognition. So I think that that is my main interpretive goal in the book. And I get there by mobilizing, a lot of theoretical approaches. There is critical disability studies. In particular, I want to mention the work of our wonderful colleague Mel Chen, whose work has been very influential for me. And if you like, we can talk later about their wonderful theorization of the couch. So there is also object-oriented ontology to an extent, but this is also an attempt to look for object-oriented ontology elsewhere, not in the OO people. So, in particular in Black critical theory. So I want to mention here my engagement with Stevens' idea of the fugitive commodity in your first book, but also Fred Moten's idea of the resistance of the object and the way this idea gets picked up on by Denise Ferreira de Silva and also to an extent by Ray Terada. And of course, there is a lot of spillers, in particular in the last chapters on ungendering and untitledness, and also the debate that that famous article generated. And I also engage with some elements, some expressions of Afro-pessimism, in particular Calvin Warren's idea of the barred object. So this engagement with Black critical theory starts from the observation that in a very famous passage of Black Skins, White Masks, the section that is called The Fact of Blackness, but that according to Fred Moten should be called the lived experience of the Black, Fanon says, I came to this world and I found that I was an object amongst objects, which of course resonates with ideas that we commonly associate with new materialism and with object-oriented ontology, but there has never been a dialogue between these approaches. So I use this as an opportunity to stage this dialogue, and maybe I can, say that staging a dialogue between Afro-pessimist and Fred Moten is not always easy. But I try to do it, and I can perhaps say where the difference lies in this specific case in the interpretation of that passage of Fanon that is so important. Of course, for Calvin Warren, the barred object signifies the equivalence of blackness with non-being, while for Fred Moten, the object is really the possibility of some kind of ontological register that goes beyond the subject, and he famously theorizes that by saying that Heidegger's jug doesn't simply pour out, but it also withholds, and so that possibility of withholding becomes, a space, of a relational or a relational counter-imaginary for blackness, which I then use in my own theorization of neurodiversity, also because Moten famously said that blackness is ultimately constitutively, intrinsically neurodiverse. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And on in the book, I would just say I'm also interested in how this approach, this interobjective approach, which is not afraid of saying that relationality is predicated on some degree of mutual use can help us reconceptualize fundamental issues of literary theory like the author, like genre, or the title, and also character.
Right, yeah, because the structure of the chapters is each one sort of takes up both these terms, like these literary terms, but also, you know, concepts like motherhood and gender, and so you're working at multiple levels in each case, you use this term, the possibilities of a post-subjective realm of the unthought, right? And sort of turning to the object to thinking about objectivity and interobjectivity rather than intersubjectivity as a way of kind of, you know, as you were just invoking Moten, sort of what escapes the unthought, but then also you are interested in framing and in the container. So there's a kind of interesting tension there and a sort of juxtaposition. And a few thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, you gave a beautiful description of what I try to do in the book. Perhaps I can, you know, explain how I reconceptualize the other, or how I reconceptualize genre or character in light of interobjectivity. Perhaps I can talk about the other more specifically. So the chapter on the other is focused on a play whose title is The Basket. Right. This is a Roman play called The Comedy of the Basket. And we know that it's based on a Greek play whose title was The Women Who Lunch Together. Okay. So it's really easy from that connection to get to the idea of distributed authorship, right? Because you know, you imagine women coming together, establishing some form of intimacy while they're having lunch and being gathered around the table, so creating some kind of circular shape. You know, that's how the interobjective comes about, and that is reflected in the Roman play that becomes a basket. Consequently, if you think the basket making is traditionally, you know, a gendered activity, and I use comparisons with other, you know, cultural traditions in which basket making is really this opportunity for women to come together and do things together and collaborate, so you can imagine that the relation that the Roman play has as with the Greek play is one of distributed authoriality, right? So there is a kind of collaborative effort. But at a certain point, you know, in the chapter, I shift the emphasis a bit, going back to Foucault's famous essay, Who is an Author, and what he says in relation to the citation from Beckett that actually set the whole theorization in motion, that is the citation, what does it matter who spoke? Or what does it matter who is speaking? Which Foucault uses basically to collapse the figure of the author into the murmur, the chorus, the multitude, and so forth. Basically the texture of a text. And so rethinking that, I ask myself two things. First, that question, who spoke, becomes quite important if we factor in that some people cannot speak. Some people are not allowed to speak. So that should be part of the consideration. And second, there is, even if we believe, as we all do, in the death of the author, when we see a basket, when we see a painting, we always ask ourselves who made it. So we immediately think of some kind of authorial figure behind the painting. While when we see a nondescript basket, we don't ask ourselves that question. And, you know, this is also a play in which at a certain point, all the characters abandon the stage and the only entity that remains on stage is the basket. So what I'm suggesting in the end is that perhaps we can or we should cling a little more to the figure of the other, and instead of de-individuating, we should think of a kind of de-individuated individuation. That is to say, think that there is a person, it doesn't matter who that person is. Can be X or Y, it's indifferent. That's why I connect the figure of authoriality in this chapter with indifference. There is someone, we don't know whether that's X or Y, doesn't matter, and in this way, the somebody becomes a something. So that's when Adorno becomes particularly handy when he says that the subject, you know, acquires a sense of his, her, or their ontology in the very moment in which they have the opportunity to see themselves as a something. And this connects in my reading with the fact that at the end of the play, we find out who the biological mother of the girl who is the protagonist of the play is, and then there is also an adoptive mother, but it's pretty clear that the issue of the real mother is not an issue. So that's how perhaps we can cling to the other by bringing in definition, de-individuation, and indefinition.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. Actually, I think maybe I'll just ask you, since we're already getting into the chapters, I'll just proceed by asking you, you've just given us an account of how you're rethinking the notion of the author, and I want to ask about character as a kind of area of mutual interest for us. In chapter 2, which is on Plautus's play Aulularia, right, which is translated as Pot of Gold, gives us the stock figure of the miser, which is taken up by Molière and others. And I want to ask you about the stock character, the stock figure, the character type, the stereotype. You know, it implies a certain kind of fixity, and you take up this notion of fixity in relation to neurotypicality. So, you know, as you were just describing a notion of de-individuated individuation, I'm thinking about that too in relation to character.
I know.
So, and the stock figure and the stock character, but then also, you know, this notion of fixity. So maybe I can just ask you to think about that.
I actually refer to your work. So let me say that this is really a Berkeley book in the sense that I engage with so many people who are in this room, with the work of many people who are in this room who are not in this room, okay? And Dora is one of them. So, yeah, this is the play that Lacan spends a lot of time on, because of Molière, because of the miser, to theorize l'objet pétillat. So in a sense, Lacan also is interested in the itness of this play in relation to the kind of alienation of the subject arrested or driven by the drive. When literary critics look at this play of Plautus, by Plautus or Molière also, they usually say that the humor there resides in the fact that we are supposed to feel superior compared to this character who can't adapt to the social, who does not want to adapt, who is too rigid. So basically, it's the idea, the Bergsonian idea of the comic as a kind of machinic, you know, inelasticity that we laugh at. And that's the notion of type, that is to say, a figure that doesn't have, you know, psychological development, that is not able to turn into character. So, and in this chapter, I kind of turn it around by actually saying that if we see the psychology of this type so rigid, so reclusive, so, uninterested in the social as an example of neurodiversity, consequently, character, that is the idea of elasticity, becomes really the typical, right? Because that's what we expect, that's what we want, that's what makes a character legible, right? So Xian Nai also talks about, this dynamic when, not in relation to neurodiversity, but when in her book on the zany, she talks about the show I Love Lucy, she's really interested in seeing, these comedic forms as dictated by the capitalistic imposition of versatility, flexibility, functionality, right? And that's basically the definition of character in opposition to type that remains fixed. So, so perhaps I can read what I say, but I think that maybe I can just read to better explain what I mean, because this is really an important point in the book. So Plautus's miser, or Moliere's miser, could be productively regarded as type if such a reduction enhances his proximity, attachment, as well as similarity to non-human objects, forestalling psychological excavation in the quest for transparent legibility over against the opacity that neurodiversity embraces. Rather than a type, the obdurate miser could be viewed as a metatype, one whose stubbornness overlaps with the alleged fixity of literary and theatrical types as such. This meta aspect resonates with the neuroqueer contestation of the flexibility, the mobility, the normative psychological functionality, a predictable, transparent versatility that paradoxically calls itself neurotypicality. So there is a sense in which, the type is actually the character, or the more unpredictable character. So the repressed contradiction of neurotypicality is that it demands a typicality, a predictability, eligibility disguised as mobility, change, freedom. In Lacanian terms, this fixity as freedom is the quintessential deception of symbolic life.
Yeah, so I mean, I think of the language of flat and round character that we inherit from E.M. Forster. So, you're kind of pointing out the roundness, sort of what counts as roundness, and the equivalence of roundness with character as such is itself a kind of neurotypical, implies a certain
the flat expression of neurodiverse people.
Right, really interesting. So if I can ask one more question on the a related point about character and de-individuated individuation, which is in your last chapter, which is called Untitled, and I want to ask you about the significance of title, the titular object, and untitledness. But you begin that chapter, which is on Terence, I should say, but you begin it with a discussion of Cindy Sherman's series of untitled film stills, which many of you know is a series of black and white photographs where she adopts the personas of various female types or cliches or stereotypes, right? Like the bombshell, the ingenue, the young dancer, the schoolgirl, etc. And you write that she doesn't simply play female types, but performers impersonating types, generic women. And this for you becomes also a way into introducing the theme of ungendering. So I wonder if you can also just talk about the generic, which is not an important term for you, but is something that sort of stuck out to me. And is that because you've given us all sorts of really inventive, interesting ways of thinking about renunciations of subjectivity or refusals of subjectivity via these, kind of fugitive modes of objectivity or of interobjectivity. And I wonder if the generic is actually also one of these, right? As a kind of, de-individuated individuation. Like, how is that functioning in the framework that you have laid out for us?
Okay, a lot to say about that.
Okay.
So maybe, should I start with genre first?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Because there is also a chapter on genre. So maybe I can just say that the chapter of genre is about figures of indeterminate indexicality. So that's how you can say that the genre becomes generic. So I play with what Marianne Dawn, for example, says about the indexical, that it's both, an expression of fullness and emptiness, right? The indexical is an indication of both immediacy, like the visness as an immediate referent, but of course in a performative context, that visness can change at any time when the performative context changes. So there is a kind of space of indeterminacy in the visness of an object. So in relation to genre, both Derrida and Eugene Brinkema famously say that genre is never a question of belonging, but it's always a question of participation. That is to say, there is always something in genre, there is something that never fits in, right? There is nothing that really belongs to the categorical universe that genre indicates. And so that space, that does not fit into a classification of genre is precisely the indeterminacy of the indexical, if you like. And since we're talking about comedy, I try to see that impossibility for a genre to be settled into a categorical definition as similar to what Berlin calls the tromic. That is to say, something that like comedy, that is supposed to make us feel good at the end, to create a sense of reparation, but that produces this sense of reparation through the traumatic, by, as they put it, by presenting the destruction of life, and at the same time, asking us, to look, at life expectantly. And in the play, this element that does not fit into genre is the dangling rope in the play and in Hitchcock's film, which I compare with this play, but also the slave who is excluded from the recomposition, reparation of the plot at the end. As for, should I go back to Cindy Sherman or titles?
If you want to, yeah.
Maybe briefly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So so you gave a wonderful description of what happens with Cindy Sherman in that chapter, in which I try to illustrate what she does by going back to Teresa de Lauretti's, definition of a woman, in which the A at the beginning performs a double function, is both the indefinite, like some woman, the individuation, but it's also an alpha privative in a sense that this indefinition produces an element of indefinition and individuation, because the photographic denotation actually does not denote in any way. It's a kind of assemblage of multiple connotations, of multiple reperformances of earlier performances of femininity. So this is quite a delicate chapter, I would say, because it's about the Roman comedian Terence, whose name was Publius Terentius Afer. So his blackness was erased to an extent in antiquity and also in modern times. But for example, Phyllis Wheatley famously refers to him. So what I try to do is to discuss this issue not in cultural historical terms, but in critical theoretical terms by using the identification of Terence with his play called The Eunuch. Like in Shakespeare, for example, in Titus Andronicus, there is a famous scene in which Terence is evoked as the Ethiopian eunuch. And so the eunuch in antiquity is defined as a thing, a little thing, a quid or a t, right, which is the Greek word for the indefinite, a little thing between male and female, and also the word eunuch means basically a closet where you put a bed, right? It's an object that is supposed to prevent people from using beds, because of course what the eunuch has to do is to preserve the chastity of a woman. So you see the interobjectivity in the eunuch. So what do? And it's not easy to do in the chapter, but I try. I basically use ungendering as has been theorized by Spillers, and in particular by people like Riley Norton, to locate there in the refusal to participate in normative forms of gender, the blackness of Terence. That's what I mean when I say that it's precisely this objecthood and this indefinition that allows us to locate blackness in theoretical terms rather than cultural historical.
Mm-hmm. So I want to make sure that we have time for questions, but I do want to just ask, since this leads so beautifully to one last question, which is a kind of more global question about method and your mode of reading, since you ended on this just now on the idea that this is it's not a cultural historical reading, but rather a critical theoretical one. So, you use the term polycontextual reading. Like you're obviously not reading these in kind of historicist terms, these Roman comedies in historicist terms. You also use the term too close reading or over or hypersensitive reading, and the close readings that you offer in this book are so virtuosic. And what I really appreciate about them also is that there's such a sense of pleasure in them. Like you're just really also having fun, sort of diving into the work, and you talk about that explicitly, but also really opening it up to such an enormous array of associations. So, maybe you could just say something about how you conceive of your practice of reading and what it means to read these Roman comedies in the terms that you do.
Thank you. Thank you for these beautiful words. Thank God they are recorded, so I can listen to them again. So yeah, polycontextual. Well, this is another term that I use to basically define what I'm doing, not just in this book, but in general. That is to say, as you said, doing readings of antiquity in a post-historicist frame. And so I always tell my students that the Parthenon was not just the treasury of Athens in the 5th century, but the Parthenon was also a Christian church, and it was also a mosque. So even if when we go to Athens, what we are shown under scaffolding is what was supposed to be, the Parthenon in the 5th century, our vision should be more open than that, should become synchronic or synoptic. That is to say, we should try to imagine the mosque or the church, because otherwise we are monumentalizing antiquity. We are establishing clearly axiological hierarchies with all their political implications. So I'm not saying that trying to apply that kind of synchronicity to reading is easy, but I think it should be done. And so these texts, these Roman plays, sort of have an anachronism built into themselves because these are actually Greek plays with Greek characters, Greek names, Greek settings in a Roman context. So there is already a kind of temporal and spatial dissonance. And also these plots are really the plots of comedies or of Shakespeare's romantic plays. So there is a kind of untimeliness, you know, to them that I think allows me to do what I do. And then I would also say something quite basic, that is to say, if I have to read a play called The Rope, how can I not talk about Hitchcock's film, Rope? I mean, I really cannot eliminate that situatedness from my, rhetorical frame of mind, I saw that movie, I read D.A. Miller, on that film. So if the play is The Rope, I'm going to do it. Also, how can I talk about that play, The Rope, all about slavery, without thinking of David Ammon's In the Hood, like the cover of Claudia Rankine's Citizen. That's why there is a reading of that. Or why can't I just bring in Alice Childress's String, right? Another great play that, or when I talk about the ladies who lunch together, I have an interlude on the famous number of Elaine Stritch, Ladies Who Lunch, Everybody Laugh, in Stephen Sondheim's Company. So as opposed to erasing, these complicated layeredness, of effects of reading and staying with what is supposed to be the object in hand, I try to mobilize all these different associations, and perhaps that can give us a sense of a Parthenon, seen in all its different historical illustrations.
It's a very relational mode of reading.
Yeah, and also in a sense, non-neurotypical, if you like, right? So there is a kind of inhabitation of non-neurotypicality in that kind of mode of reading.
Yeah. Right. Thank you so much. So I think we should open it up to questions from the audience.
Thank you.
Hey, Mario, I'm back here, by the way. Hey, I'll sit back down. So excuse my, I'm still working through the text. I got to do the introduction and everything. So excuse any possible misinterpretation here.
Not at all.
So I'm kind of working through this idea of the sort of post-subjectivity that you speak of. And this question of the subject sort of be being sort of constituted through relations. And it's kind of hard not to kind of, I guess, think about, and I know we've had our sort of conversations about Aristotle, but it's really difficult not to sort of think about the flexibility of the sort of pros T, the sort of the towards something, the reference to that he talks about in categories. And it seems like the text is attempting to kind of give that relation a new type of sort of autonomy, particularly around, I guess, a type of sort of ontological ground. But for him, as we both know, that sort of relation was always sort of dependent on a type of sort of substance. So I guess how are you, I guess, wrestling with that sort of, I guess, that ancient sort of approach with the modern sort of shift that it seems that you're putting forth here with relation, that type of tension? Does that kind of make sense? I'm not sure if you...
It does.
Yeah.
I'm going to offer a disappointing answer. I'm just not reading with Aristotle.
Yeah.
But I'm not saying that should not be done. It can be done. And I'm just deciding. I don't think that Aristotle provides some kind of normative framing for how we conceive relationality. We can do it, and something really productive can emerge as the work you are doing. but I guess I find my points of reference elsewhere. So for me, there is no difference between, in a post-historicist frame of mind, I think I can allow myself to privilege Adorno over Aristotle, or to privilege Black theory over Aristotle. And then if there are productive convergences that emerge, and they can emerge, that's wonderful.
Yeah, yeah, got it. All right, thank you.
There's a question over here.
I'm really thrilled at the chance to read the book in the future.
Thank you.
So I might ask a question that is answered elsewhere in the book, if so, fantastic. But I'm also just interested in your perspective, coming from a media theoretical lens myself. And I'm so interested in this kind of like decontainment or the potential of deframing an object through this kind of like untimely reading, and the capacity to kind of take an object and debound it so that it might, in our reading, like engage these wide entanglements that it might have. That's so useful for media forms expanded beyond film, even to think about design and to think about, you know, even within the Hitchcock film, to think about what is imbricated in like the many expansive qualities of like a filmic object. And so I'm curious if there's a space in this where you find that your reading is also coming from a standpoint that is critical of the proliferation of technologies that you yourself engage with, and how technology might be implicated within that like kind of framework of the untimely, or I would almost say like trans-historical kind of reading as well.
Yes, I do refer, I mean, that's a wonderful question, and thank you so much for asking it. In the chapter on the other, at a certain point, I do talk about how the internet has changed how we see auto-reality. And I do engage with both Rancière and Anna Kornbluh's, right? These ideas of immediacy, that you go online and you immediately can become an author, but in a sense, you know, what you're posting becomes, you know, the author herself, right? So I guess that's a point of entry, you know, that perhaps into what you were saying, you know, and there is a discussion of that in the book. Yeah. Thank you.
Is there a question there? Maybe
Yes.
I have a wandering in my head in the form of a question. You talked about mobilizing different associations and non-neurotypicality. Is there in your practice, have you found a line beyond which it becomes so obscure that you have to sort of become that container that knows how to withhold and not bore too much? Have you found that in your practice?
Well, I do actually like containers very much, you know, and actually, you know, there is an epilogue in the book, which is quite personal, in which I compare the experience of reading and reading compulsively, as I do. There is an element of compulsion, there is a kind of death-driven reading, which is really about being in a container, right? Being in my room at home, being with my objects at home, being in my book, being in the text, you know, that I am analyzing. So that's why I think that interobjectivity can also perhaps help us go beyond object relations in psychoanalysis, or can complement, you know, that very important psychoanalytic perspective. We are told by Melanie Klein and Winnicott and others that we relate to the mother as an object, the breast and all of that. I've never had that experience, but this for me is the mother, right? In a sense, this is what gives birth to me, because otherwise I don't think I have any kind of ontology by myself that is unrelated, you know, to the book. So the container is important.
Thank you.
I also talk in the book about the J.D. Vance episode.
It's a lot about the couch, it turns
Right.
out. And
So do you remember that? When, you know, this false rumor emerged that J.D. Vance was having or had intimate relations with his couch. And of course, and I think that that was also connected with Tim Walz's idea, oh, that's weird. Republicans are weird. And then Trump hugged the flag at a certain point, and Josh Shapiro said, oh, that's weird. But then the Republicans turned it around because they directed that accusation at Tim Walz's son, Gus, who actually identifies as neurodiverse. So I haven't written extensively about this, but I will. And I mean, my conclusion is, why do we think there was so much discussion of J.D. Vance doing that? And then it turns out it was false. So maybe it's a kind of liberal snobbery against, you know, Appalachian people, marginalized community in Appalachia, and it's a kind of snobism that actually disavows non-neurotypicality. So I think that its weird rhetorical strategy was effective, but was also problematic. Wasn't that effective?
not ultimately.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Mario. I think I understand some of your, I haven't read the book yet, what you're worrying about the notion of genre. So do you think that we need genre as a notion, as a category, as it were? I mean, I take your objection to how people may use it is it somehow fails to do justice to the particularity of the items that we put into a category like tragedy or comedy. But do you see genres having advantages as well?
Well, yeah, in a sense, it's inevitable, right? Yeah. It's a handy, you know, taxonomical category. It's helpful, but it can make us oblivious sometimes to things that are so obvious, like the fact that Roman comedy asks us to laugh at slaves being put in their place constantly, right? There is a traumatic element, you know, to a traumatic dimension in these plays that, you know, rarely gets discussed precisely because genre imposes that we see this as simply funny. But as Berlin pointed out, the funny is always co-implicated with the unfunny. That's why I find their notion of the traumatic, you know, so powerful, you know, to revisit our perceptions of genre in relation to comedy in particular.
Yeah, I mean, tragedy, comedy, historical.
Right. We have 1 minute. Oh, Miriam.
I guess since we're at the end, maybe you could tell us where you go from here. Like where do you hope this book will take all of us? And also where do you go after this book into your next projects?
Well, the next project is actually on Edward Said and on his last book on late style. And, you know, I have a draft of the book, and there is a connection because Said devotes a whole chapter of that book to Glenn Gould, who famously left the stage, decided not to perform anymore, and decided to perform only in his own studio. And Adorno actually similarly thinks of music as something that should not be staged, or that music realizes its full potential not when it's staged, but when it's actually read, you know, privately through the musical score. And of course, that essay by Said is strongly Adornian, so neurodiversity plays a role there too. So there is a connection, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The next book chat will be pretty soon.
Oh, no, well, see.
Thank you so much, Mario.
Thank you, Dora.
Thanks, everyone. Awesome.